Some people are going to love these rankings. Some people are going to hate these rankings. I talked about it this week. After week 5, this is where we finally start to look at resumes because, like I mentioned, there's really no point looking at resumes when teams have played so few games. You have teams that really haven't played any quality opponents. Now, at this point, everyone has at least played, at least one Power 4 opponent. So we have a decent idea of how good these teams are, but there's still a long ways to go. And the season is a journey to figure out who the best teams are and how to correctly rank the teams. So we're not there yet. These rankings aren't going to be great. But I've said before, any rankings before this past weekend were bad. And at this point, I think we actually can come up with some pretty good rankings that are fair at this point. And so I think some of the teams that I have ranked, where I have them ranked, some people are going to have some issues with. But I do believe that these rankings are fair. So the way that I've done this is I have looked at the games that have been played. And we've looked at close games. And close games mean teams are similar. And we group teams together based on close games. So that means, and then we put the teams into tiers. So that means that, for example, Mississippi State just played a very close game with Tennessee. Tennessee played a close game with Alabama. Alabama played a close game with Georgia. Tennessee played a close game with Georgia. Georgia played a close game with Alabama. All of those teams would be in the same tier because they played close games against each other. And you can go on and on down the list and compare and group all these teams together. And so in the second tier of teams, which these teams I just mentioned, these are in tier number 2, there are 35 teams. So there are 35 teams that are very similar, and they've all played close games against each other. And so to separate those 35 teams, we're going to go with the resume. And then we have our top tier teams, which they're separated with the resume. And we'll get to those teams because we're going to have 8 teams in the top tier, in tier number 1. And then we have a couple of teams that are like in between tier 1 and 2 because I can't figure out which tier they're in just yet. And so the top 10 is going to be that kind of that top tier. And then you have 35 teams with only 15 spots remaining. So that means you're going to have a bunch of teams that have, that are in that tier that I believe could be top 25 teams, but they're not ranked because they don't have their resume. And hopefully this makes sense to you guys. But that's the way that I'm doing these rankings. And so let's jump right in. Again, resume is just splitting, that's how we're ranking the teams within these tiers. And so we have teams. I wanted to mention these teams because these teams all have all the teams on the top row: Houston, Maryland, Louisville, BYU, all undefeated. But their resumes just are not good enough. They don't have good enough wins. BYU just beat Colorado. That's a decent win. Louisville just beat Pitt. That's a decent win. Maryland has a win over Wisconsin. Houston also has a win over Colorado. But Houston actually would be ranked because they beat Colorado kind of easily, but then they have the Oregon State game, and that's really kind of that's why Houston is not ranked. But these teams, again, undefeated, want to recognize them. Then you got Cincinnati, Nebraska, Virginia, Utah, and USC. These teams all are very close to being ranked. I mean, I've strongly considered them, but when I really compared the resumes, who they lost to, who they've beaten, these teams just didn't quite make it in there, but they are very close. So again, the teams you see on your screen right now, if you want to rank them, if you got them in your top 25, I have no issue with that because they were very close. I mean, it's a razor thin margin when we're trying to separate these teams. And then I didn't really consider any 2-loss teams that are in the second tier. I think if we're going to look at one, we could have considered Auburn because they've lost to 2. I don't want to give away my rankings, but they've lost to 2 top 10 teams, and they lost to them by 1 score. And they have one over Baylor, who Baylor is in this tier. Baylor's played close games with TCU, who's played a close game with Arizona State, who's played a close game with Mississippi State. And again, we go back through all those teams. But if you look at that Texas A&M game, I know it was a 1-score game. They really got dominated. So you have to, it's not just about the scores. You have to watch these games and see how they play out. And again, with 2 losses being in tier 2, I didn't want to put them in here. If they beat Georgia, then yeah, okay, we'll rank Auburn. So let's get into the top 25 now. But first, just a quick reminder, the Voice College Football Late Night Show is right here on Monday night. So this show is Monday through Saturday every night at 10 o'clock Eastern Time or after the games on the weekend. But on Mondays, we're putting it right here on the SG1 channel. So you can join Mark and myself. This will be at 10 o'clock Eastern Time live. You'll have an opportunity to call into the show. We have some guests on here as well. So make sure you check it out. 10 o'clock Eastern Time, Monday nights, right here on the SG1 Sports channel here at the Voice of College Football. All right, so let's get into the top 25. We've got 21 through 25, and I already know people are going to have an issue with Georgia and Alabama being at 21 and 22, but those teams have not proven, and again, we're not looking at preseason expectations, we're not looking at preseason evaluations, we're not looking at the names on the jerseys. If Alabama and Georgia were let's say Vanderbilt or Missouri, and they had done exactly what they had done on the field, I'm telling you, they would not be ranked where they're ranked in the AP and coaches poll. And I don't even know where they're ranked, but I think I saw a little bit of the AP poll. I think that they were top 15, but I don't think they were in the top 10. But yeah, anyways, we have to just look at these teams. And again, I believe these rankings are very fair. So let's just go through the resumes. TCU at 25, they've got a decent win over Baylor. Again, talks about Baylor being a tier 2 team. And then North Carolina is not a good win, but at least it's a Power 4 win. And that's actually what got, like, that one win was what got, I'm telling you, it's razor thin margins. That win doesn't mean much to me, but it meant enough to get them into the top 25. I believe Utah was the team that it was between them and Utah. The win over Baylor actually was kind of the difference there. But let's go now to number 24, Mississippi State. Of course, the win over Arizona State. This is a tier 2 team, and they've got a close loss to Tennessee. Tennessee at 23. Head-to-head does matter here, so Tennessee has the win over Mississippi State, and that's why they're here. Again, a close loss to Georgia, who have Georgia ahead of Tennessee. They have Alabama ahead of Georgia. So these teams, Alabama beat Georgia, Georgia beat Tennessee, Tennessee beat Mississippi State, and they all played really close games. So I believe those teams should be ranked very closely. I don't believe Mississippi State was ranked in the AP poll. Again, I didn't look at it closely, but they should be. I mean, if Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, if these are all top 15 teams, why is Mississippi State not ranked? That again, it's all about the name brands, and I hate that. But I believe, again, that the way we've ranked these teams this week, they are fair. Again, Alabama has the win over Georgia, but it matters how you value Georgia. Do you value Georgia as an elite team? Because they haven't really proven that, unless you think Tennessee is an elite team. And if you think Tennessee is an elite team, then Mississippi State has to be an elite team. So again, if we're going by what's happened on the field, these teams should be ranked close together because they've all played close games against each other. All right, let's move on to 16 through 20. Florida State, I know they lost to Virginia, but again, that win propelled Virginia into tier 2. So they're in the same tier, so it really comes down to the loss for Virginia, a little bit of a worse loss. Florida State has the win over Alabama. So Florida State is sitting there at number 20. And then we've got LSU ahead of them. This is kind of a tricky one because of the Clemson game. Because Clemson, all of a sudden, they don't even look like a tier 2 team. They don't even look like a team that should be in that group of 35 teams. But they are actually, because Georgia Tech's there. They played a close game against Georgia Tech. And because of the games against LSU and Georgia Tech, those kind of outweigh the game against Syracuse. And again, if they didn't have both the LSU and Georgia Tech games to look at, then they would not be in the second tier. But anyways, yeah, LSU, they've got a couple of decent wins. Florida and Clemson, 2 wins again against tier 2 teams. Again, when we talk about separating these teams, is there really a huge gap between Florida and Clemson and, let's say, Mississippi State, TCU, some of these other teams? I really don't think there's a huge gap there. I think as we go through the season, we start to separate these teams and we have more tiers because it becomes a little bit clearer. But at this point, all those teams are grouped together. We got Michigan at number 18. They've got the win over Nebraska. That's a very solid win. And they lost to Oklahoma, who's a top 10 team. Illinois, with a couple of good wins now with this win over USC. So we're starting to get to some better resumes. Now that we get to Illinois, we've got teams that have multiple good wins. So Illinois has a win over Duke on the road. That was a good win. Duke is in tier number 2 based off of what they've done on the field this year. And then again, USC. So Illinois, what's keeping them from actually being a little bit higher is the way they lost to Indiana. So that is keeping Illinois from, because if you just look at their wins, you could argue that they should be a little bit higher. Arizona State, they've got a couple of good wins now. Their loss was on the road at Mississippi State in a close game. So Arizona State's resume is very solid, and they are sitting there at number 16. All right, let's move on to the top 15, and let's see who we got here. So Vanderbilt at number 10. They are 5-0. They've got a good win, a pretty good win against South Carolina. I don't know how good of a win that really is at this point, but they won that game comfortably, and so that's why you see Vanderbilt there. Iowa State has put together some quality wins now. They blew out Arizona, very impressive, and they've got wins over. Iowa has kind of climbed back into this tier 2 team because of their performance against Indiana. So that win looks a little bit better. Kansas State took care of business. That win looks a little bit better. So Iowa State's resume, this is a team that I didn't have ranked last week, but the resume has them ranked this week. Missouri has a solid resume now with a win over South Carolina, win over Kansas. They got a couple of good wins. Georgia Tech escaped against Wake Forest in a close game, but you look at the resume, they put together some pretty good wins. And then you got Ole Miss, by far. If we're putting Ole Miss in tier number 2, which I think you have to because they played close games against Kentucky and Arkansas, but they do have this win over LSU. But if you look at their resume, like does any team have more quality wins? Maybe not great wins, but quality wins. Arkansas is a quality win. Kentucky's a quality win. Again, not great wins, but these are Power 4 teams, conference opponents. They've got a win over Tulane and now a win over LSU. So, again, give me a team that has 4 better wins than Ole Miss. I don't think you're going to find that. So, in my opinion, out of these tier 2 teams, Ole Miss does have the best resume, the best wins, and that's why I have them ranked at number 11. But they are not in tier number 1. Again, when you play close games against Kentucky and Arkansas, I can't put that team in tier 1. I just can't do it. All right, so now this is where it gets interesting with our number 9 and 10 teams. Indiana and Oklahoma. So these teams are not in tier 1, but they're not in tier 2 either. They're in between because they have shown us that they kind of have been both. So Indiana, the win over Illinois, a blowout win over a tier 2 team shows me that they're a tier 1 team. But then a close game against Iowa shows me they're closer to a tier 2 team. So they're in between. And Oklahoma's in that same boat. A nice win over Michigan where they won pretty comfortably, but then a close win over Auburn. So that's why these two teams are, again, in between. That's why I put that red line there, because I wanted to make sure it was clear. These teams are not tier 1 teams, but they've done a little bit more than the tier 2 teams. They looked a little better than those teams. That's why I have them at 9 and 10. So now let's get into the top 8. Everyone is going to be outraged with number 8. But again, if we're not going to penalize teams for playing tough schedules, I think you have to put Notre Dame in tier number 1 because they lost by 1 possession to Miami and Texas A&M. Those look like tier 1 teams. That tells me that Notre Dame is in the same tier as those teams. And then they confirm that by blowing out Arkansas on the road. Arkansas, not a great team, but this is still a Power 4 team, a team that played Ole Miss close, a team that barely lost to Memphis. Arkansas is not terrible, and Notre Dame went and blew them out on the road. So to me, Notre Dame is a tier 1 team, but they clearly have the worst resume just because you've got 2 losses, and that's why they're at number 8. Penn State, same scenario here. Now, there is a chance that Oregon and Penn State are not tier 1 teams, but I believe Oregon was dominant enough against decent teams, Power 4 teams, that Oregon proved that they are an elite team. And so with Penn State playing them in a very close game, an overtime game, I think they're in the same tier. That could be wrong. Maybe we find out that Oregon was just playing really, really bad teams, and maybe they're not tier 1 teams. But I think, again, with the close games, you have to put Oregon and Penn State in the same tier. Penn State just hasn't beaten anyone. So they're at number 7. Texas really doesn't have a resume either. They haven't beaten anyone, but they played a close game with Ohio State. Now, Ohio State's a little bit more interesting. Is Ohio State truly a tier 1 team? And if they're not, is Texas? Obviously, Texas is not a tier 1 team. So that one is a little bit tricky for me. I would like to see Ohio State go out and really blow out Minnesota this week to confirm that they are a tier 1 team. I believe that they are. The Washington win was, they took care of business. Again, we don't know for sure how good Washington is. So that there is still some figuring out, like I mentioned. But I do believe at this point Ohio State and Texas are tier 1 teams, and they played a close game. So the top 5, again, this is all going to come down to resume. So Texas Tech is one that I think people may have some issues with. Utah has been really impressive, and they won that game comfortably. I know it was close in the fourth quarter, but Texas Tech was dominating that game. I looked at the total yards when I was putting together these rankings. I should have wrote it down, but I think Texas Tech had over double the yards that Utah had in that game. And they were clear, if you watch that game, they were clearly the better team. And so to me, if Utah is a tier 2 team and Texas Tech went on the road and dominated them, this is a tier 1 team. I mean, Utah has been very impressive in their other games. So Texas Tech, in my opinion, is in that elite tier at this point. Again, we need to see more to really confirm that, but I believe that they are. Texas A&M, because of their performance against Notre Dame. And then, again, that Auburn game, they dominated that game. I mean, it wasn't close. Auburn had 1 yard, I think, in the fourth quarter. So it was a weird game. They had a bazillion penalties. That's why, again, you can't just look at the score. If you didn't watch that game, you saw the score and said, man, Texas Tech barely beat Auburn. No. I mean, Auburn had the ball in the fourth quarter, and it's like, well, I mean, what are they going to do? They couldn't do anything. Texas A&M's defense dominated that game, and really the penalties just held back their offense. Ohio State sitting there at 3. They've got the win over Texas. That is a very good win. Miami with a little bit better resume because they have a win over Florida added into that one over Notre Dame. But I've actually got Oregon at number 1 because they were so impressive against Oklahoma State and Northwestern. I know those are not good teams, but I mean, they completely dominated. And then I think they have the best win in college football going on the road and beating Penn State. You can make an argument with Texas A&M going on the road and beating Notre Dame, but you know, again, they had the game against Auburn, so that's holding them back. Just if they went out and beat Auburn by 3 touchdowns, I think Texas A&M might be my number 1 team. I really do. But Oregon, just because of that win, I'm just giving them credit for going on the road. You know, Miami's wins were at home. Ohio State's win was at home. Texas Tech's win over Utah, not quite as good of a win. So that's my reasoning for putting Oregon. I just think they've been the most impressive team, and resume-wise, I think they've got the best win. But I could absolutely see the argument for Miami because they've got the win over Notre Dame and a win over Florida. Ohio State has the win over Texas and a win over Washington. So it's really just how much you value that Penn State game. I put a lot of value in that game because it was on the road. But in my opinion, the number 1 team should be out of these top 4 teams. I think those are the 4 teams that have already kind of proven themselves to be really, really good elite teams. Then there's really no doubt. Now, Texas Tech, some of these other teams, we need them to confirm that a little bit, but I feel like at this point they are tier 1 teams. So that's how I'm ranking my teams moving forward. The tiers will start to split up, and we'll kind of separate. You know, maybe there's a tier where Alabama and Georgia and Tennessee, maybe they separate themselves and they go into a tier that is above what is currently tier 2, and we turn tier 2 into tier 3. Things like that could happen as we go throughout the season because teams do get better. You know, speaking of Alabama, you know, I don't think the team that played Florida State is, you know, the team that played Georgia was much better. And so teams get better, and you have to kind of look at that, but you also have to look at the whole season and what they've done, their total body of work. But I believe that these rankings at this point are as fair as they can be. And I know that a lot of you are going to disagree with this, and I would love to know your thoughts on, like, what do you disagree with? Why do you disagree with it? And keep in mind the philosophy that I'm using to rank these teams, because if you have a different philosophy, then obviously you're going to have different rankings. But based off of the philosophy that I'm using, if you have any issues, let me know. And give me your top 25. How would you rank the teams? But let me know down in the comments below.